All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Ray Chang. I am the president of the Asian American Christian Collaborative, and I'm really excited to be on this call and to be recording this interview with several friends, including Jay Catanus, who is the director of ecclesial advocacy, and then two special friends from the AND campaign, which is a Christian organization that seeks to help people live into civic values as well as engage in the political world out of a Christian worldview and a Christian framework. I hope I got that right. You guys can correct me if I'm wrong. But I have Justin Giboney and Michael Wear, and I've gotten to know them over the years and appreciated their friendship as well as their deep engagement and their values-driven, conviction-driven engagement around political realities from a Christian perspective. Yeah, I'm just going to dive into it. You know, I was super appreciative of the way that both of you were so quick to sign on to the Asian American or the statement on anti-Asian racism in the time of COVID-19. I'd just be curious if, you know, what as you read it, what were some of the impressions that you had, and why did you sign it and endorse it?
Yeah, for me, and thanks for having us on, Ray. I'm glad to be here. I think for me, anytime I thought it was timely. And any time I see a group being treated unfairly or see rhetoric that is dangerous towards one group, I think it's just a natural reaction, especially with the AND campaign kind of bent, to jump in and say something and do something. And so I was glad that you guys created that statement. I think some of the things that were going on in society around COVID and some of the names that were being used and the scapegoating was just unfair, but it's something that Christians definitely shouldn't condone. And it is not enough for us to just kind of privately say, oh, that's unfortunate. But I think we do have to step up and say, no, that's not right. And I'm going to be public about saying that's not right. That to me is the Christian ethic in part. And that's why I thought it was important for me to be a signatory on that.
Yeah, I mean, very similarly, it was a moment for solidarity. I mean, I think we saw what was going on and thought it was a moment to stand with brothers and sisters to say that, like, this is not right. This is not what public leadership looks like. This is not how we ought to respond to crisis, by turning against folks and like Justin said, looking for scapegoats, looking for people and people groups to blame. And so I also just appreciated your guys' leadership. I mean, I thought the statement came together well. I was encouraged by who was involved with it. And so I want to thank you for the leadership you showed in stepping into a moment like we have, which is it's not always easy.
Now, I don't know who would be familiar with the work that you're doing. You know, I'm definitely familiar with it. Jay is familiar with it. But could each of you kind of share with us a little bit about yourselves so that our audience would be able to get to know you, and then also about the AND campaign, what you do and what your aims are? Sure.
So I am the president of the AND campaign, the co-founder of the AND campaign. I'm also an attorney by trade, but also I've been doing political strategy and running political campaigns for about a decade. And the AND campaign, I think you said it pretty well, the AND campaign is a Christian civic organization, and we're focused on raising civic literacy. We want Christians to be engaged with politics because we see politics as an opportunity, really a robust opportunity to love our neighbors. We think it's a great tool for that, but it should be a tool and never a master. And so we want to teach Christians not only how the process works and why it's important, but also how to apply biblical values to the most pressing issues of the day. Too often Christians either see politics as something that's too big or too dirty to get into. We say, no, it's not too big for God, it's not too big for the church. But at the same time, it shouldn't be, and some people go to the other extreme, it shouldn't be something where we allow our politics to guide us, or we allow a political party or ideological tribe to guide us. And so the AND campaign is really focused on helping Christians focus in and be Christians first. There are some folks in our organization who are Democrats, some are Republicans. I don't really care, but I want Christians to be Christian first and know that when it's time to disagree with my party, or time to critique my party or my ideological tribe or my cultural tribe, then that's what I have to do, because my first loyalty is to is to God, and I'm trying to be a disciple through my political engagement.
Yeah, and I'm Michael Wear. I had the experience of working in the White House under President Obama and running religious outreach for his reelection campaign. I became a Christian when I was 15 after reading Romans, and had been interested in politics before that. When I became a Christian, it was for a while. I knew everything had to change. For a while, I thought, well, now I need to like go to seminary, become a pastor. You just want to do the most Christian thing, you could think of. And thankfully I had, thankfully I had a pastor in my life who said, Michael, look around. There are Christians who are not pastors if you take some time to notice. And I thought, oh yeah, that's good. That's some good guidance. That's good discernment there. And so really the vocational question that's guided my life is, what does it mean to be faithful in public things? And so I learned a lot out of my experience in working in government, working directly for political campaigns, and wanted to take that experience to the church and to working to equip the church for healthier political engagement. I had known Justin for a while. We do a podcast together, the Church Politics Podcast. I think we've been doing for three years now. And the opportunity came to join forces and for me to join the AND campaign, which I see as one of the most, and I said this before I joined, so this isn't completely biased, one of the most promising vehicles for really in the short and medium term, changing the paradigm and the status quo in our politics. And it's through just that, like the principal thing I learned in my time working in the White House and presidential campaigns is that the state of our politics is a reflection of the state of our souls. Yes, there are structures and things that we could change. Yes, campaign finance reform would be helpful. We need to stop gerrymandering, all that stuff. But all that stuff happens because of what we incentivize as voters, what we incentivize as Christians. And so at the AND campaign, we're really concerned with helping Christians think Christianly about our politics and trusting and knowing that that's going to have effects downstream.
I'd also add too that one of the underlying objectives that we have, and a serious objective, is racial reconciliation. We see a political divide in the church, but it's coupled with a racial divide. And we can't get to that racial divide because we can't have a conversation about the politics. And so what we try to do is, in a very real way, without holding any punches, is to critique both sides, be able to bring both sides to the table and say, hey, we can't come to here and being prideful and acting like we're all innocent and faultless. How can we talk through this, admit where we've gone wrong, look at the history, especially when it comes to race, and be honest about the history, and move forward from there with Christ at the center of what we're doing.
Again, I just want to welcome you guys. This is Jay in Chicago. I'm the Director of Ecclesial Advocacy. Now, that title is kind of made up, but what it hopefully is going to do is what you guys are both talking about and have really led the way on. So I'm a big fan of what you have been doing. In Chicago, there's a lot of AND campaign folks, and I've signed on to one of your guys' statements. I was following the e-launch of that, and I'm really excited about that. I want to just backtrack a little bit to something that Michael said about the state of our souls, and then Justin, you kind of touched on it also, talking about history and not pulling punches about it. Can you say a little bit, either or both of you, about how we got to the place where we are? Your name is the AND campaign, which is not only critiquing both sides or bringing together things that other people think are polar opposites, but from a Christian perspective, we know these things in Jesus Christ are both well addressed, right? Biblical values and social justice. And so I would just love for both of you or either of you to unpack, how did we get to the place where we are right now, where we can barely seem to have a conversation?
Yeah, I think it starts, you got to go back to the beginning. I think you almost have to go back to America's original sin of slavery. And you see that throughout history, time and time again, the American church, the majority church, has failed on race, plain and simple. It doesn't mean that it's irredeemable, Doesn't mean that everyone had terrible intentions who was a part of it, but the fact of the matter is, and it's really hard to dispute, that the church wasn't there when they needed to be there. Now, on the other side, this is the interesting thing about it. It actually was faith-based movements that actually tried to fix the problems too. And obviously, all those haven't been fixed. But if you look at the civil rights movement, if you look at abolition, many other movements, you see the church also coming in and leading and doing things the right way. That's where we start. And I think the reason that we haven't been able to completely mend things is, of course, we live in a broken world. But power is a big part of it. And when Christians get addicted to power, Christians don't want to give up their power. You've come to a situation where, you try to form your theology or rationalize your theology around a political, a social political understanding or concept that just isn't biblical. And we've seen that over and over again in the church. But I will say this: I'm not one of the people who thinks it's hopeless, or that there aren't folks and white evangelicals out there who want to do better. I think they do, and I see movement there, but we have a long way to go. But we have to address the history, and we have to address it honestly. We can't address it in a way where anybody's trying to be faultless or kind of maintain the perfect narrative of, we always do good and, things are perfect now, or we want to be colorblind. We just have to be honest about it, but also aspirational about it. Because I think on the other side, we can get to a point where we're so cynical and we're so hurt that we can't lead people in the right direction because we've almost given up or lost faith in the fact that God can change this.
Yeah, that's good. I just there's so much to this. I just add that I do have a lot of empathy for folks in this time where political technology has gotten so sophisticated, and we're really at the beginning, which is a scary thought, that politics is just able to reach deeper into people's lives, into people's psyches, and into communities than really it has before, with and in a more personal way. And so I think people are lacking the education, the resources, and I mean we're in a new environment and people don't have the resources to be able to discern when they're being manipulated in politics, how to pursue the truth, how to make sure that they're not that they're making decisions in a way that reflects discernment and not manipulation. And so I think part of the challenge right now is to make sure that we're not letting people off the hook for acting in sort of crazy ways, making bad decisions, but especially when we get to the level of everyday citizens, having a level of sympathy and being able to help them build up the civic kind of tools to navigate what is a very complicated political system, particularly when you're trying to raise kids or go through school or work a job. It's a lot to sift through and try and discern the motives and the intentions of politicians. And it's why, the AND campaign tries to do that. It's why we need more sort of civic infrastructure to help voters do that.
Well, that's really good. One of the things that I really love about the AND campaign is that you really give a place for the church to be involved. And a lot of times, I'm a pastor. I've been a pastor for 10 years. And even though, my doctoral training is in Christian ethics, but it's hard from even the pulpit or from an immigrant community, and in a city like Chicago, which also has a lot of, power centers and history. It's hard to know where to start. And you guys have really provided a great way for churches to say, hey, we don't have to just jump into this ideological camp or that ideological camp. And for many of us who felt not only racially and ethnically homeless for a long time, but theologically and politically kind of homeless, I've always been very attracted to what you guys are now doing because of that specifically. So I want to just follow up with a question, and then I'll let Ray jump in with his own questions. But I love hearing what you guys are working with these days. Right now, we have people storming state capitals and carrying guns. I just obviously have to acknowledge the fact that these are white protesters and they're being mobilized and supported by different interest groups as well. And I cannot imagine if they were Black carrying guns to a state capitol, even getting into the Capitol buildings, or if they were people of color. I can't imagine what that would be, but I'm just thinking one of the big community issues we have is immigration. And people are quick to shout out at us, Romans chapter 13, submit to governing authorities. But I don't hear anybody saying that to these folks who are trying to protest against or even outrightly defy the stay-at-home orders in their state. And I would just love if you could kind of help us to contextualize this, or, how do we understand what is going on in our country right now? And feel free to educate us, because we're also trying to lead our own church communities from Asian American communities forward in this discussion as well. So if you could just comment to help us understand what's going on from your perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I'll do my best to explain it. I think, one thing we always have to keep our eye on in this conversation is when I see these type of things, I got to see hurting people. Now, hurting people doesn't mean that I excuse them or that I say it's okay, but it does frame the way that I respond. The way that I look at this is that there are protests that are constructive and civil, and there are protests that are not constructive and not civil. And I think this seems to be in the latter side of it, right? I mean, when you go to the point of why are we having quarantines, right? Why are they asking us to social distance? I'm sure there are a lot of conspiracy theories flying around as to why that might be. But if you really think about it, it doesn't seem like the point is to hurt people, to hold people back. And so these protests right now in the middle of a crisis, when the protest itself and the nature of the protest and the nature of what you're doing is actually violating or could actually hurt your neighbor in a lot of ways, then we just have to think twice about that. I've said, and I say again, I just don't, as far as the guns go, I don't know why the guns need to be there. What's the message behind that? I think this just goes back to being civil and being uncivil. I think being civil is superior to being uncivil for the same reason that being a nonviolent protester is more courageous than being somebody who's carrying a gun. And I think it comes down to that. What are you protesting and why? Even Dr. MLK said that there are good protests and then there are ones that aren't so good. And we need to really look closely to make that distinction, but also remember not to go as far to say people are irredeemable, not to go so far to not see the hurt that these people may have. And Christians, not everybody can do that. Christians have to be able to do that in our public witness.
Yeah, just two quick things to add. I think one, it shows the extent to which our politics has become about self-expression and sort of show and presentation. I mean, you watch so much of what was at the protests, and there's almost that interesting kind of self-mockery going on at these things, a sort of self-caricature kind of. Many of the protests seemed to recognize the role that they were playing. It was just a really odd spectacle. We have a politics of spectacle right now, and sort of self-expression and sort of projecting oneself onto our politics. And then the second thing, I mean, you raise a good point about Romans 13, and I think what's upset a lot of folks, especially I think younger evangelicals across the spectrum, is this sort of selective leveraging of scripture when it's appropriate, and then it goes out the window when it's not, and that's a cynicism-inducing thing. Now, that's not to say some principles apply in some circumstances one way and apply in a different circumstance a different way. That's not to say that Romans 13 always has the same application in every circumstance, but I do think you're tapping into something significant there, that there seems to be a lot of hypocrisy when it comes to applying religious values and tenets to political circumstances that so often, interestingly, seems to match up with people's ideologies anyway.
No, that's so good and that's so helpful, and I appreciate those insights. A part of the reason that Jay and I are so excited to be connecting with you is because one of the things that we've noticed, and anyone who's kind of paid attention to politics, especially from the Asian American engagement, is that Asian Americans tend to be far less engaged when it comes to like voter turnout than than any other racial group. And even though we're the fastest growing minority group in America, and that shortly we'll be 1 out of 10% of the entire voting bloc, our participation levels currently are less than 50%. So less than half of our votes are actually being cast. I think what's interesting, though, is that it's not because Asian Americans don't have opinions on relevant issues. Actually, what a lot of data seems to show is that we actually have strong opinions, and that even in some states, Asian Americans actually make up like a winning margin in the state districts. But then simultaneously, one of the things that we consistently find is that there's very little funding that's directed towards Asian Americans and Asian American political engagement, as well as very little kind of voter outreach, right? So politicians are at a significantly reduced level, are not reaching out to Asian American voters. And I think a part of that has to do with the language barriers and the hindrance of not speaking English as a first language. But other parts of that are actually driven by the model and minority myth, which basically says we are good at putting our heads down, working hard, minding our own business, not really addressing the issues that really matter. And one of our hopes is that people would see political engagement as a part of their discipleship, because we are a part of the polis, or the part of the city. And to be a part of the city or be a part of a society means that we are fundamentally political beings. I would be curious if either of you have any insights into either why that might be beyond the things that I've shared, and Jay, I'd love your input too, on Asian American kind of disengagement, as well as what you think, what words of encouragement that you might have for the Asian American community to engage, especially Christians, in the political realm. You've touched on it a little bit earlier, but it would be great to hear a little more.
Yeah, so a few things, and I think you obviously, Ray, I think you touched on some of the important factors here. A few things. First, we're in an incredibly important time right now, specifically for Asian American civic life and participation, when we talk about the census. And so the census is just absolutely essential when we talk about participation, when we talk about distribution of resources, when we talk about having a map so that institutional actors know where to send resources. Well, the census is one of the key ways that they do that. And so when I'm talking with, I had the pleasure of working with, the Office of Public Engagement at the White House, had someone specifically doing AAPI outreach on the campaigns. We had someone that was in charge of AAP outreach that I got to work with and stay in touch with those folks. And census is just at the top of the priority list right now. And so we just encourage people that there are organizations that facilitate census involvement, organizations that make sure that there's accountability on the government side, that folks are being counted correctly, that we're past this now, but that there were efforts around making sure that the census asked appropriate questions and was collecting data that could actually be useful. And so I'd say that's important. Ray, you are right. Historically, Asian American civic participation has been lower, not just in terms of voting, but in terms of contacting public officials, in terms of attending kind of town, city council meetings or other political gatherings. You touched on a lot of reasons for that. I think there are others that we could talk about. What I will say is I've been encouraged by the increase that we've seen even over the last decade or two. And so I think, especially as you get to second generation and third generation, these are muscles and freedoms that, like when you're a first generation immigrant, you are just keeping your head down and you're just trying to make it. It's part of the blessing that you're able to pass down to the generations ahead of you, that they feel like they have the ability and the standing to participate. Obviously, we want to encourage all people that if you're here, you have the standing to engage civically. Not just the standing, but we talk about the responsibility too. But I'm seeing a huge increase in that. I'm seeing just in the last 3-4 years, the number of Asian American civic organizations increasing. Run AAPI. My friends over there started that organization, encouraging Asian Americans to run for political office and supporting them. But you're right. There's we need to look at institution building in this space that can support the empowerment and sort of inculcation of these civic practices.
Yeah, no, fun fact, the 2010 census, I was actually in a commercial that went national to try to get Asian Americans, more specifically Korean Americans, to vote or to fill out the census, because our turnout was so dismal. It was so bad. And so, no, I'm thankful that you guys are working on that in the White House.
Can we hear that commercial now? Can we listen at
I show for like 3 seconds, I wave.
that wave inspired a generation, right?
That's right. It was the spark. But Jay, I'd love to hear what you have to say too.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of reasons that those of us who are from within the Asian American community kind of identify. The immigration narrative is so important with that. You know, when, as both Justin and Michael said, when you arrive at a new place, it's not easy to engage civically. I mean, you're focused on survival, and even though you would love to, there's a lot of internal and external or structural reasons why it might be difficult to do that. But the Asian American community represents such a diverse community, right? And you're talking about people from a part of the world that has about 1/3 of the world's population. But when you come to the United States, just kind of lumped together in this group or block called Asian American. And even that is so diverse in so many ways, religiously, linguistically. But it's also the hope that we have at the Asian American Christian Collaborative that we can provide space like you all are providing space. I don't know how closely you read it, but one of the things that we were committed to addressing, or at least expressing in that statement, it was not only that we wanted to speak in a way that was ecumenical enough to be grounded in the Christian tradition and to be historically grounded and bring together people who have typically not interacted in a way that we could say we all together stand against anti-Asian racism. And I think that's one of the reasons that it won such broad support. But secondly, we wanted to specifically say that, like Justin mentioned earlier, Asian Americans have not always had the best track record of supporting other communities of color. And there's a lot of unfortunate reasons for that. And there are also a lot of exceptions, like you said, Justin, within the church and outside of the church. There are histories of people who have done a great job standing up for the vulnerable of all kinds of people. But, you know, I'm just wanting to kind of present to you all and say, if you could ask one thing of Asian American churches specifically, so we can start within the Christian community, knowing that the AND campaign is serving not only urban Christians, but specifically starting from, or, you know, bringing voices from urban churches out into the broader public square. What would you want to see from Asian American churches and Christian communities that would serve urban Christians well, knowing that some of the urban Christians are also Asian Americans themselves, but many are not?
Yeah, I would just say let's fellowship. Let's start with a conversation. I think once we build relationship, it'll be a lot more clear why folks may want to engage issues that may not directly always impact their community. And in general, I just say, look, reach out to churches and ask them what their issues are. Speak up, right? When you get an opportunity to speak up, or there's things being said within your community that you aren't right, and that goes for me and everybody else, just speak up about it. But once we engage the AND campaign, check us out. Once we engage, I think it becomes a lot more clear why we should, fellowship, why we should join hands, and what we should do. I don't know that I would say you have to care about this issue. I mean, people have different things that they're focused on. But once you engage, I think folks will be compelled to act, hopefully.
Yeah, I just quickly say, there's this passage in Galatians where the Apostle Paul calls for members of the church to bear one another's burdens. And I think that's a really apt call when we think about public life. And so, like Justin said, there needs to be great sort of Christian freedom there needs to be great Christian freedom for folks to, like, everyone's not going to be focused on the same issues, that kind of thing. But to the extent that we could see the struggles of other Christians in particular, but neighbors generally, as our own, as something that we have a stake in as well, that's a good starting point.
Yeah, well, I think one of the reasons I love the work that you're doing is that you try to take things from a Christian perspective and then apply it into political realities. The challenge that a lot of Asian American Christians would have is that as soon as you start thinking politically, you automatically are associated with being partisan, right? And so there's a difference between the two, and I appreciate the ways that you kind of critique both sides and then uphold the good that both sides are really upholding. But there's a study that came out of a bunch of professors from Stanford and Dartmouth and several other institutions that showed that on the average in America, Americans hold their political identity to be greater than their religious, ethnic, or racial identities. How would you say your work is trying to break through that, and why is that even? I mean, we all know what the problem is, but maybe you can approach this from a perspective where someone listening in might not know anything about political engagement, think that political engagement is automatically partisan and very divisive, and then move from there.
Yeah, I think in general it comes down to idolatry. All right, it comes down to putting things before the faith, and we have to make sure that our identity isn't in politics. That's one of the main things that I say over and over again. You can be a Democrat, you can be a Republican. I really don't care. I don't think any different of you. I want to hear what you have to say. But you can't. You have to be somewhat detached from your political, your political ideology and your politics. Otherwise, the decisions are already made for you. You can't really even respond from a biblical worldview, because the answer that you're supposed to give, your tribe has already given for you. And so you better go along with that answer. And that's just not something that Christians can do. Christians have to apply a biblical worldview to what we do. We have to think through what we do. And I tell people over and over, being a party, but being hyper-partisan is not an option. And I even question, partisan loyalty. Again, being a party, if that's what you prefer, but does partisan loyalty mean if they're wrong that you still go along with them, that you won't call them out? What exactly does that mean? But I would say the main thing is not putting your identity into your political party or your ideological tribe. Having a detachment that allows you to stand back and critique it. And so in that way, you can actually be prophetic within that space, rather than just being somebody who's kind of a weaker version of Democrats or Republicans.
And it's important to have what Justin just said at the forefront of your mind, because our entire political system is built around, everything is built around incentivizing. It makes it so much easier for the politicians if folks are not thinking for themselves, if they're just following the party line. I tell people, when you register for a political party, when you register to vote and sign up for a political party at the DMV, there's no fine print that says, I hereby sign over my conscience to every jot and tittle of the party platform. And yet that's how we act. And if I'm a registered Democrat, that means I got to fall in line with everything the platform says. Not even thinking about the fact that the Democratic Party platform says one thing, it will say one thing in August at the Democratic Convention than it did 4 years ago in 2016 and 4 years before. So am I supposed to change my views every 4 years, just depending on what vote takes place at the party convention? And so we need to understand that our politics is seeking to form us. It's in its interest to form us in the way that we're most pliable, that we're most useful to our political system. But look, if we're being most useful to political actors and those in power, that means we're not being as useful as we can be to our neighbors, to those who deal with political decisions that are being made. And so you can't just, you're not just going to find yourself slipping into a healthier way of political engagement. Yeah, you actually have to be thinking about it and working about it and building community where you're in a community that's trying to engage in politics in a more healthy way.
Yeah, you definitely have to be deliberate, right? Like it just doesn't happen out of nowhere. And Michael made an excellent point. Kind of the point of the people who are in the business of politics is to make sure that they form you. Because if I, as somebody who's a political strategist, if as a Democrat strategist, I could form you and make your politics, your Democrat politics part of your identity, that's easy, right? It's just less work that I have to do. I don't have to come to you every time and really explain why this is the best policy. It's just a given that this is the best policy, because guess what? The people on the other side are so bad that certainly you don't want them to win, right? And so you're just going to follow me. We really have to be aware of that. The other thing I would say is everybody wants folks on the other side to kind of separate themselves and challenge their party, but they don't want to do it by example, right? So you say, well, why do Christian Republicans just go around and just go along with the party? But then as a Christian Democrat, you get mad when other Christians criticize your party. Something's got to give. And so we have to be willing to say, man, party is cool, but I have something bigger that transcends partisanship.
Yeah, you guys are giving us a lot of hope right now too. I think as a pastor, I hear what you're saying, and the call is a very intentional one to community formation. The only way that we could ever address or even name our idols, or the idols that our ideologies and our identity communities kind of teach us or form us into, pursuing, is if there is another kind of community like the church that hopefully is centered around someone else and is forming people that way. I'm remembering Graham Cole, who was one of my seminary professors. He said that, the Christian story is one of the few kind of attempts to narrate the world. And one of the other competitive or competing narratives is that's put out by liberal democracy. And I don't mean liberal in a partisan sense by that. I just mean in the sense of, finding our identity in our partisanship or in whatever identity we're taught to have. When we launched this statement and also this group, I just would want to be honest right now and say there are many ways of approaching Asian American identity. And there also have been many formations of how people are well formed in engaging and presenting or even signaling their Asian American identity, and then where that ranks in comparison to their identity in Christ or in their identity as part of the Christian church. So I really appreciate the call to formation. I think that's something that we tried to name in our statement, in our call to action. But to hear it from you all, it really resonates, and it's an affirming call to action that together we can join in forming our people. We call it discipleship, but formation really just gets more intentionally at the practices that we engage in day by day.
I love it. I feel like we could talk for hours and keep going, but I do want to pivot and kind of round out our conversation. I'd love for people to know how they can get in touch with you and engage with the work that you're doing, but then also to hear a little bit about the new initiative that you guys have going on right now, which I think is in line with our heart for the churches as well. And so maybe you guys can share a little about what you're doing.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I kind of take those in reverse. So the Churches Helping Churches Challenge, I think, is what you're referring to. This is a rough time, and it's especially a rough time for smaller churches. If you're in a low-income area or a church in a low-income area, you probably aren't getting a whole lot of income to begin with. But then once this crisis hit, you have a lot of workers in your area that are quote-unquote non-essential workers. You may have an older congregation that's not necessarily able to give online. And so very quickly you realize that you've got a crisis on top of a crisis because your church may struggle financially to make it through the COVID-19 issues. In understanding that and having conversations with pastors in the AND Campaigns network who pastor smaller churches, we just decided that, hey, this is an issue that is calling for the church to be the church. You know, one of the main things that we should be doing, if we look to Acts 2, we looked at, 1 John, we know that the church is to be the first one that goes out and helps our brothers and sisters. If a church is struggling, if a believer is struggling, we should be there. And so really the Churches Helping Churches Challenge is just calling churches to do just that in the middle of the crisis. What do churches do? What should the church do in the middle of crisis? Stand up. And we're asking churches to stand up. So what we did, we created the COVID-19 Church Relief Fund. And that is a fund where we are receiving applications from smaller churches to give them $3,000 grants to help them through this moment. We teamed up with the National Christian Foundation, who's actually administering the fund. 100% of the proceeds go to these churches. There's an application process, but it's no strings attached. We trust that these churches will do the right thing with the money. We look over their essays, the reason that they're asking for it, and kind of go from there. But I think the bigger thrust of what we're trying to do is actually get churches like churches in Chicago, larger, more financially stable churches, to reach out to some of the struggling churches in their area and do what the church is supposed to do. So that's really what we're trying to challenge folks to do. We actually have a very good team in Chicago that's doing just that, Atlanta, in the Bay Area. And so it's going really well. And then again, an objective kind of running alongside this is racial reconciliation. If we can come together in a moment of crisis, in a time where we need each other the most, that once we get through this, when we get through this, then maybe we have a starting point for building a relationship and becoming the united church that we should be. The second question was, what was the second question? I'm sorry, I forgot it.
Just a little bit more about your organization, what you guys are doing generally, and then other things that you might be planning on doing, what's in the hopper, and then how people can get involved or connected with you.
Yeah, I'll start this off and I'll hand it to Michael. But if you want to get in touch with us, you can always email us at engage@andcampaign.org. And so that's one way to get involved with us. One of the biggest things, so you can also follow us on social media @andcampaign. One of the biggest things that we're doing right now is we have a book coming out on July 21st, and it's called Compassion and Conviction. It's the AND Campaign's guide to faithful political engagement. And that really is our gospel-centered framework for Christians to kind of use to really, hopefully we'll come out of 2020 better than we came out of 2016, because we know a lot of stuff that happened there. But we want to give Christians a framework rather than just having a partisan framework. Let's give them a gospel-centered framework. And so it's very Bible study friendly, and we're really excited about that. We also did our 2020 statement, which was we wanted to put a gospel framework for politics into the public square so that Christians could see something to model kind of their political engagement after. But I'll let Michael kind of.
Yeah, those are the main items. Would just we have two podcasts the AND Campaign does, the Church Politics podcast and the Faith 2020 podcast. Would urge folks to check those out. And then we have a website, thecruxandthecall.com, which provides every weekday 4 quick reads so that you could understand the major news that's driving the day, and then original essays and articles from folks in our community, just looking at faith, politics, culture. And so that's another resource, thecruxandthecall.com. But yeah, we're really excited about this book coming out with Ivy Press in the summer, and looking forward to getting that book in the hands of folks. And like Justin said, we're glad it's coming out when it is. We think the timing might be right.
The timing is definitely right, and we're very excited and thankful for that. Congratulations on the book coming out, and I'm so thankful for what you all are enabling other churches to do. I think some folks, and maybe not for any fault of their own, are removed from what a lot of urban churches go through, or a lot of other struggling churches, may face. But when you all are giving them opportunity, and I hope we all can give them opportunity to be involved in new ways, I think that's a great thing. One thing that Justin was saying reminded me of Galatians 6:10, which said, "So then, as we have opportunity, let us do good to everyone, and especially to those who are of the household of faith." And just thinking of our responsibility to one another, and as followers of Jesus and people who belong to the body around the world, there's so much that we need to rally together to do and take responsibility for each other. And I'm excited that you all are leading the way and helping us to do that. So I think this is kind of a weird question, but because, we're starting out as a group, we're not all brand new as individuals, but, how would you advise the Asian American Christian Collaborative? What are some things that you've learned along the way? I'm thinking of the difficult place where you sit, where you're willing to, from a Christian perspective, critique the various ideological camps. I'm sure you've learned a lot through that. And I would just love to hear, if there's one or two lessons that you've picked up that you could pass on to folks who will hear this and watch this. I'd love to hear that from you.
Yeah, the first thing I would say is persevere. There's going to be ups and downs. There are going to be times where you think, man, we're getting it, people are getting it, we're good. And the times where you say, I don't know if anybody gets this. So just kind of persevere through it. You guys are doing the right thing. But then also, I guess this kind of goes in, when you're staying the course, just understand everybody isn't going to necessarily get it. And so you cannot change who you are based on every piece of criticism, right? The reason that you're needed is because people don't necessarily get exactly, what's supposed to be happening and why we're missing this. And so as you get criticism, be open to it. Self-examination is important, but you can't change your mission and who you are and what you're doing based on all the criticism. Receive it, look at it, and then, if it's not who you are, what God's called you to do, then keep moving. But sometimes, you can get discouraged if you think that everybody's going to be your cheerleader. God's given you a mission, and you got to stick to it.
Yeah, one of the most difficult things about this kind of work is that civic life doesn't provide the same kinds of immediate satisfaction that other work does. In business, or if you have, you could put something out and, sell it, and how many copies you sell, or how much product you're moving, or, the correlation between the input and the output is just much more clear in civic life. Even if we accomplish what we want to accomplish in our politics, especially when it comes to public policy, it's very hard to claim credit that it was your input that got it done. And that can be really difficult for folks to stay in it when there's not that immediate feedback mechanism. So one of the more effective things that you could do as an organization is just find little ways to communicate to those who are investing with y'all that look, progress is being made. Look, the ball is moving in this way. These people have been affected by the work that we're doing. Finding ways to communicate sort of a feedback mechanism that the system itself isn't going to provide in as direct a way, just so folks feel like their effort is worthwhile. I think that's really important encouragement.
That's so good. I want to thank you both, Justin and Michael, for taking the time to be with us. Jay, me, and the rest of those at the Asian American Christian Collaborative are super grateful for both of you and everyone else that's a part of the AND campaign. We have many friends that are directly working with you. And so, I hope that, our relationship can continue to deepen and we can find ways to meaningfully partner in the future. But more than anything, I think we're just grateful for your public Christian witness in a very, very, very polarized age.